Welcome to Books on Point. In September 2018, Collan Rex, the former water polo coach at Parktown Boys High School, was found guilty of 144 charges of sexual assault and 14 of assault and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. The story made front-page headlines. Brutal school ties uncovers the school's culture of violence and initiation, shrouded in a code of silence. It follows the trail of broken lives of the victims. For the first time, they break that code and the ties that bind them, and also have the confidence to not have it gag them. Author Sam Cowen joins us on the line to talk to us more about it. Sam, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about, what prompted you to want to, uncover this and write the book and, follow the victims and bring their story out.
It actually started with another case. So I had become friendly with Olivia Jazriel, who is one of Bob Hewitt's rape victims, and she and I have been working on a couple of interviews where what I had said to her that I wanted to bring across with her interview is when we hear, especially in this country, that children have been raped, women have been raped, men have been raped, we think of it in numbers because they're so huge. And if I say to you 15, 12-year-olds were raped, it sounds terrible. And if I say 60 girls were raped, you go, oh, that's awful. But when I tell you that Olivia, at the age of 50, having been raped at 12, still baths in bleach, that's when you sit back and you go, oh, my word, that is the consequence of something like that. And when we finished the interview, she said, you need to do this for the Parktown Boys. And I'd covered the story only briefly. When I didn't cover it, I'd stayed abreast of it, because it was so terrible. And it did make all the news headlines that Collan Rex, this water polo coach, had pleaded guilty to 144 charges. At one point, I think he was facing 327 and had been sent to prison for the equivalent of the life he had lived up till then. So he had been alive for 23 years and he was sentenced to 23 years. And at first I thought, well, much as I had with Olivia, where the victims had never had a voice, I thought that's what I would like to do, is talk to these boys who were brave enough to come forward, brave enough to testify, and give them a voice. And for me, when I started writing the book, it was about looking to showcase some heroes and one terrible villain. And by the time I got to the end of writing the book, I realized there were no monsters. There were only victims, and that includes Collan Rex, because all of it had been done to him when he was at school.
Right. Talk to me about the process of putting the book together. How long did it take? And also establishing the relationship with those who came forward.
That was the most important part. The reality is that I never went in wanting to do an expose, and I cringe a bit every time someone says it's an expose, because the commitment I made to the boys was that I would only take what detail they were prepared to give. And I said to them, if I ever ask you a question and you're not comfortable, say to me, Sam, that's too far, and I'll back off. And so I approached the parents first. And it started with the whistleblower, who in the book is called Ben. And Ben and his father were very forthcoming. And I talked a lot to them. And from there, I moved on. I was chatting to the matron at the time, Mariette Bossett, who is a complete saint. And she gave me names of boys who were prepared to talk to me. And from there, I started talking to more and more people. And the more I heard from the boys, the more I realized that I needed to speak to Collan, because he was a boy as well. And you'll see in the book where I talk in the chapters, each chapter is named The Boy. And Collan's chapter is The Boy Who Went to Prison. And I heard more and more about how where this had started was the grade 8 camp, and these boys were all telling the same story, and their parents were telling the same story, and even people who had been at the school at the time, although not necessarily as pupils, were telling the same story. And from there, I had to explore something I wasn't planning to explore, which was, what is it like to go to school in grade 8 and be initiated to the point that you understand that you never tell, that you never speak, that snitches get stitches, that what goes on to her stays on to her. And if you tell, then you're a weakling and you're not a member of the school.
Right. There are many characters who jump out at me, and for me it was the story of James, the boy with the scars on his back, particularly because he cannot remember how he got them, and you almost get the sense that he was so traumatized by the entire experience that he may have blacked out from that entire process. Talk to me about James.
James is very special, an incredibly intelligent boy. Lives with his dad. His mother passed away just before he went into grade 8. And he's the only boy that I interviewed who didn't try to make sense of the system. He knew it was wrong. So with other boys that I interviewed, they would say, well, I worked out this is the person you can talk to. This is the boy you buy tuck for. This is the trick you can joke with. James was just bewildered. He couldn't understand how everyone was okay with what was happening, the level of brutality. And the tragedy of James is really seen in the interview I did with his father, where he says he has no idea what happened to his son except what he's been told by the teddy bear clinic. He has no idea what has, what's transpired sexually. He has seen these marks. That James went from a happy, open little boy to refusing to swim anywhere without a T-shirt. He won't go in the pool without a T-shirt on because these marks are still so livid on his back. And when I said to him, what do you remember about being beaten? He said, absolutely nothing. He said, I have no idea how I got them. And I think the part that made me the angriest in the book is that James was on suicide watch and was on an enormous amount of medication and still managed to pass the trick. But the school, with no explanation, stopped paying for his medication and psychiatric and psychological care at the beginning of this year. And only after his dad had made repeated attempts to get hold of them did they say, well, actually, he's left now, so he's not really our problem. And it's just this kind of brush off when it happened in the school and they knew about it. You can't just say that because the child's left school that automatically he's cured or he's fine. He's not fine.
Right, Sam, before I let you go, just quickly, what kind of conversations then should we be having about these cultural norms and practices at school that seem to pretend as though they're training you to be a man?
So here's what I think is important. One of the things I've been accused of is trying to close down Parktown Boys, and my intentions couldn't be further away from that. Traditions, specifically in boys' schools, are good and true. If you look at the mission statements and the mottos, they're all fantastic. And in fact, it's Ben in the book who says Parktown wants to do everything right. They just stands for everything right. They just go about it in the wrong way. And I think what's happened is that traditions that were about bonding and brotherhood and bravery have become about protecting a face. And they've moved from being traditions and worthy traditions into being bad habits. So here's the thing. It's kind of like the way to go forward as parents is to start talking to our kids. Now, a boy who hasn't been talking isn't going to magically start. That's when you reach out to other parents and say, listen, I know my son's we don't know each other well. Our kids have just been in school for 6 months. But do you think, is your child coming home tired all the time? Are there unexplained bruises? Are pieces of clothing not coming home? And the analogy I like to use as well is that of a biscuit factory. So Parktown has 100 years of tradition. And it's not the only school I've been spoken to about. I mean, I could do a series. But if you make your biscuits exactly the same way for 100 years, you've still got to be updating your machinery. You've still got to be checking everything works the same, right? I mean, what happens if the machinery breaks? Well, in a biscuit factory, you machinery, but in the school it's kind of like, well, this has worked for 100 years, so we're just going to carry on putting the biscuits through, and if you don't like it, it's because you don't like our biscuits and you don't like us.
Yeah,
that's
so
no one is saying.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I think most of the viewers follow the point and the message you're trying to get across, which of course is that you need to have those conversations, ask the brutal questions and those tough questions about the system, especially the kids that are in school. Well, that's it for Books on Point. That's Sam Cowen talking to us about her new book titled Brutal School Ties. We'll have more news at 2 o'clock with Nompumelelo at the top of the hour. Goodbye.